So in chapter 4, we're going to change up production a little bit, and we're going to draw the production possibilities curve in a different fashion. In chapter 3, we had a linear production possibilities curve. Now in chapter 3, the structure that we had, as I said, we had one factor of production, which is called labor, and then we said that all of the units of labor were identical and they could be used to produce either of the two goods. So we gave them productivities, and then we said, oh, okay, then that we could use our labor to produce bread or steel or whatever those goods are. But since all of the units of labor were the same, they were interchangeable. The production possibilities curve ended up being linear. So we want to give an example so you can sort of intuitively understand why we're going to draw the PPC differently in chapter 4. It's going to be bold, and the reason would be that we're going to assume that it's increasing costs. So now let's keep, I had a video where I showed constructing the PPC assuming we had 10 units of labor and then taking the productivities of that. So take the same idea, we have 10 units of labor, but now we're going to change the goods a little bit. I'm going to call them houses and food. And we're going to say we have two different types of labor. There are chefs, and then there are carpenters. And we happen to have 5 chefs and 5 carpenters. And not surprisingly, chefs have greater productivity in making food than they would making houses. And then carpenters are better at producing houses than they would be producing food. So a chef in 1 unit of their time, or one of these chefs could produce 10 units of food, but if you use them to produce houses, they'd only help you make 2 houses. Whereas carpenters could produce 2 units of food because they're not very good at making food, or they could make 10 units of houses. So we said when you want to construct a nation's production possibilities curve, you can start by figuring out what the points on the axes would be. And to do that, conceptually, you think of, suppose that this nation takes all of their resources and puts them into the production of food. How much food can they produce? Well, we'd have 5 chefs and 5 carpenters, and they'd all be producing food, so all food, we would have 5 chefs, and they'd be producing 10 units of food each. And then the 5 carpenters would be producing 2 each, and that would give us 60. So if we put all of our production into all of this nation's resources into producing food, all 10 units of that labor, they could produce 60 units of food. Now, suppose you put all of your resources into producing houses. Well, our 5 chefs would only be producing 2 each. And then the 5 carpenters, well, now they're doing what they're trained to do. Carpenters are more productive. Times 10, not 2. But that still gives us 60. So that would mean when we came up here to graph the PPC, we know that this nation could produce 60 units of food, and then obviously no houses because they put all of the workers into producing food. And if you put all the workers into producing houses, you can't have any food, but you'd have 60 houses. Now, in chapter 3 then, when all the labor was identical, we could simply connect these 2 points on the axes, and that's our production possibilities curve. But when the labor is not all of the same, then we have a different option. So if we were to connect those, I'll just dot this in here because that's not what the PPC is going to be. But if you did what we did in chapter 3, it would look like this. Well, suppose you want to produce some point in the middle here. And then suppose what you decide is, let's let the carpenters produce houses and then the chefs produce food. So what you'd have is the 5 chefs are producing food, you have that, and then the carpenters, instead of producing food where they're not very good, you have the carpenters produce houses where they can produce 10 each. So when you put the 5 carpenters and have them build houses and the 5 chefs and have them produce, make food, well, you'd get the 50 units of food and 50 units of housing that gets produced. So what you'd come here is you'd have 50, and try to draw this to scale, there are 50 and 50, and this nation could actually attain that. They can produce 50 units of housing and 50 units of food by putting the workers, letting the workers specialize. When all of the inputs are not the same, and you want to produce houses, well, you make the clear case of, oh, you want to have you put the carpenters into producing houses, you put the chefs into producing food, you use the specialized resources to do what they would what they're trained to do, that. And then what you would end up having is, well, each of these, the workers have different productivities in the different goods, but they don't change. So as you wanted to shift it, and if you tried to produce more than 50 houses, you'd end up having a line here to connect 50 and 60, and then you'd have a line to connect 50 units of food and 60 units of houses. So this is what the PPC would look like in this case. And all I did here was to change a little bit to say that the units of labor are no longer identical or homogeneous, but rather they're differentiated and specialized. And when you use the resources that are specialized or good for producing a good first, so you use the resources that are good at producing food, they produce a lot of food. When you try to take them out and produce houses, well, they're not producing, those chefs aren't adding very much in the way of houses. And so this has got to be flat up here, because here's where you're having chefs try to make houses, and they're building very few extra houses. And down here, you're getting to the point where you're having the carpenters try to make food, and they're not very good at that, so you don't get a lot of extra food. So you have something that looks like this. Now, what we're going to do in chapter 4 is actually, instead of having, we have 2 line segments like this, what we actually end up doing is say like, oh, let's make this nice and smooth. So we'll draw something that looks like this for the production possibilities curve. Remember that the slope of the production possibilities curve shows the opportunity cost. And so what we saw here is that when we had the linear segments, the opportunity cost of producing food, as we try to go from here with no food to producing more and more food, changes, because when we use chefs to produce food, the opportunity cost is 1/5. So for the chefs, their opportunity cost of producing food was 1/5, but when you get into carpenters, and they want to produce 1 unit of food, the opportunity cost for the carpenters become 5. So what we saw here is that the opportunity cost of producing food, when you're having chefs produce food, is 1/5. And then once you've got all the chefs doing what they're supposed to do, if you try to produce more food, now you have to take these things that are specialized in producing houses to try to produce food, and that opportunity cost went from 1/5 to 5. Well, instead of just having go from 1/5 to 5, what if you imagine it going from being very low here to getting steeper and steeper? And that's what you're showing by having a nice smooth bowed shape to this. So the bowed shape to the production possibilities frontier is illustrating the fact that the cost of producing food, because remember, the slope of the PPC is the opportunity cost of producing the good on the x-axis. So as this PPC becomes steeper, the other saying is the opportunity cost of food is becoming higher as we go. That's why we say increasing cost. As you produce more of one of the goods, the opportunity cost of production rises. We live in a world of increasing costs, and so that's what we have here. We smooth it out to draw the PPCs in chapter 4 to be bold like this. But you can, I hope this isn't in the book, but a way to try to sort of understand where that's coming from with an extension of what I showed before about constructing the PPC. So This is how increasing costs affects the production possibilities curve.